Good evening. Welcome to another edition of the World Tonight. It is February 19th, 2021. I'm Peter, joined with my co-host Adam, and we're apologizing for a few minutes of technical delays, but we are here. Anyway, let's get started right away on the show. Adam has some updates for us from previous weeks of the show. Adam.
Yeah, we've got loads of updates to go into. I've just realized right now that we have 3 overall. So I'll start off with the Olympic Tokyo chief, who had previously been forced to resign over sexist and derogatory comments. That position has now been appointed to a Siko Hashimoto, who is now president of the committee. She is a woman who is a very strong contrast to the former chief who, as I said, made those derogatory comments. And she is expected to take on the role and try and, drive Japan towards a state in which their Olympics is fit and ready after a wave of sort of apathy towards it. Just a bit about her that I found quite interesting. She's represented Japan in speed skating and cycling at the Olympics themselves. She's also done other organizing events for sports-related stuff, but it'll be quite fun to see that she's now playing a major part in Japan's organization of it. The second update that we can go to today is to the DRC, where there has been a new prime minister appointed. So the DRC's president has appointed Jean-Michel Sama Lukonde Diendéré, I hope I got that name pronounced right, as the new prime minister. This new prime ministerial candidate is a former director of the state-owned mining company in the DRC, and has dedicated his initial speeches towards wanting to prioritize security in the Eastern Congo, which is one of the most unstable regions in the country, and also his own home region. He is replacing the former Prime Minister Sylvestre Ilunga, who was forced to resign after a motion of censure was passed against him in the parliament. This is important because the former president, Joseph Kabila, has much less power from when he stepped down in 2019. A lot of the reasons he was able to really keep hold of this power and what the previous ruling coalition was composed of was due to him wanting to retain some significant power. That power is now lost, or to some extent it's significantly lost. So we'll see how that goes. And the question now is, how do the president and prime minister transform a very diverse playing field of actors and stakeholders, and how to turn them into a coherent government that's actually able to get stuff done, because ultimately the DRC is in a very poor state. Mm-hmm. The final update that we have is to Ecuador and its presidential election. So previously, last time, I mentioned that the left-wing candidate Aras will be going to the second round, which was confirmed. But there was also a bit of contention between who would be going to the second round, whether that was Lasso, who was the more conservative candidate, or Perez, who was the more anti-capitalist indigenous rights candidate. It's now been confirmed that Lasso will be going to the second round, so it will be a pretty, or polls say, a pretty obvious divide on who's going to win, that being Aras, who is able to take a more commanding lead than Lasso, or at least that seems to be how the voters are faring at this stage. Mm-hmm. And I think that as a whole is our update corner. Lots of excitement from across the world as things progress, as they always do. So yeah, there we are.
Indeed, always fun. And as mentioned, the changes of the guard, especially in Japan, with a woman being the Olympics chief, is quite a shift, something that ironically Shinzo Abe always wanted but never could get. So that's always a bit interesting point. But anyway, moving on to another fascinating event, and is this week's protests in Catalonia as a result of the regional election that occurred last Sunday, which gave the nationalists a win, but also had other intriguing results hidden beneath the overall picture. Now I can explain the entire week in a nutshell.
Yeah, so this has been a really fascinating election, and I think I'm going to focus a bit more on what the election means for Catalonia as a whole. So this is a very important election because this was the first election in which separatist parties, that being ones that want to separate from Spain and form an independent Catalonia, won 50.9% of the vote, surpassing the sort of 50% threshold of their vote for the first time. So it also saw, as I said, separatist parties winning their I believe, highest
Mhm.
actual showing, and it's strengthened a majority that currently exists in the legislature. But another set of interesting results is that the local branch of Spain's ruling Socialist Party got their best ever result at around 23%. So that's also possibly signifying something quite interesting, because their whole response to the Catalonia crisis is one of dialogue, and sort of bringing Catalonians back and making them feel Spanish. Some other interesting notes to take from this election: there was a low turnout, 53%. The COVID-19 pandemic definitely contributed towards that, which was massively down from 79% in the previous election in 2017. So definitely some contrast there. Some election experts have pondered that this has favored separatist parties whose supporters were more mobilized as a whole. But, that's just general speculation there. To what this means as a whole for Catalonia. So the leader of the centre-left Republican left of Catalonia, who represents the largest separatist party in the regional legislature, has urged the Spanish Prime Minister to enter into talks to agree on an independence referendum. So there was sorry?
No, I said the joy, more
yes.
referendums.
Exactly, and we already know, or those listeners that are very keen to Spanish politics. There was already one held in, I believe, 2017, which was declared illegal. So there's definitely some hope from the Republican left of Catalonia, which is obviously still for independence, but a bit more softer than their centre-right counterpart. So it doesn't seem like the issue of separatism will be going away now that there's a more centre-left to left-wing party in charge. In fact, there was some speculation that the Socialist Party and the Republican left could get together into some form of coalition. They'd have to bring in some other parties, but it doesn't seem like that is something that will sustain, given this desire to have some kind of referendum. Although who knows, maybe them cooperating at a government level with socialists could lend itself to being more kind on a referendum conditions.
That is.
Sorry. Go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Okay. Okay. So I was just going to say, I think the socialist Socialist Party's I'd say win here really is quite fascinating, and it really lends itself to the fact that their major candidate in the election was the one who led Spain's coronavirus response as health minister, and you can debate how well they actually did, but for a lot of people who were actually there in Catalonia and believe he did a good job, really lends itself to the success of the Socialist Party. So yeah, as I said, the Socialist Party has an interesting role. Maybe they could form a government with the Republican left of Catalonia, but again, I think it'd be unlikely. The final points to make, and just to the other parties, is that the centre-right pro-independence Junts won an estimated 32 seats, which was just slightly less than the Republican left and the Socialist Party, and the far left separatist party, the CUP, got 9. So both these parties are considered key to achieving another separatist coalition government. So on one side, we have a very interesting situation in which possibly could a centre-left, left-wing separatist party work with the Socialist Party, who are unionist. But then you also have the other issue that if a separatist coalition wants to form, it's going to be very shaky. Currently, the Republican left are already in government with the Junts Party, but bringing in the CUP will also be really interesting because they are very anti-capitalist. They're far, they're very far left. So how they cooperate with a centre-right party, it's quite difficult to see how something like that would work out. Finally, the Spanish nationalist far-right party, Vox, won 11 seats for the first time that they have any kind of representation, which was ahead of the People's Party, which is the main Spanish Conservative Party. And they also got ahead of the Liberal Citizens Party. So it's a whole exciting mess of results where who knows how the coalition will form out. As far as I'm aware from the research I did beforehand, though it may be out of date, the actual Republican left have focused their efforts on trying to bring in the CUP and Junts. So it seems that their attention is more focused towards a separatist coalition.
Indeed, and also should be noted with the Vox result that its leader, Ignacio Garriga, is the first elected politician of African descent within Vox, a party obviously that has had controversy with allegations of racism. That is an interesting saga in its own right with Vox. Another big loser, I would say, in this vote that occurred is the civilians, the party of the civilians, who went from 36 seats in the Catalonian legislative body to just only 6. A massive defeat on their end, from being the party that was really the big thing at the last election back in 2017 to crashing. And yes, as Adam mentioned, Salvador Illa, the former health minister, whether you view Spain's coronavirus response in a good way or bad way, was popular with the voters, and that's what mattered in his case. The socialists did very well in what they had to do, and they may not form the government because of the unique oddness of all the independence parties, but it does give them a strong mandate as the strong, as one would say, defender of keeping the Spanish state as it is. Much better than what the People's Party, when they were the main thing around in Madrid were in their relations with Catalonia. So it'll be interesting to see how that dynamic works and how the Sanchez government, more moderate dialogue talks, move on the next few months with a bigger push for independence referendums. Yeah,
and then just as a final thing away from the election, because I think we've covered most things.
Mm-hmm.
There have also currently ongoing protests it's really across Spain as a whole, but also quite significantly in Catalonia over the arrest of a Spanish rapper who was recently convicted of praising terrorism and insulting the Spanish crown in messages on social media. So I guess that's another thing to look out for if you're interested in researching further. I haven't got too much research on it because I didn't realize that this was something that was happening. But yeah, so I think the election as a whole is an interesting one to look forward to. And
the government formation.
And also government formation. And then also maybe next time, if the protests are still ongoing, that's definitely something we'll touch upon next time when the World Tonight appears once again next week.
Indeed.
Cool. Right. I think, so that's everything. So going on to our next story, we have quite an interesting little return of a certain political figure in France. Peter, would you like to take it away?
Indeed. So for all of you who were Brexit maniac fans who enjoyed the lovely drama of this saga, the EU's chief negotiator, one Michel Barnier, is now back in the French domestic scene. That's right, at Michel Barnier, reported this week by Politico Europe, was announcing a new group called the Patriot and European to gather lawmakers of the center-right in France to discuss release of that. Of course, many view this more as Michel Barnier's front to begin a potential French presidential run. Of course, Mr. Barnier is a member of the Les Républicains party, which is currently suffering mediocre ratings in the mid-teens in the current result, but many believe that if Mr. Barnier were to run in this election, he would very much become an instant candidate of a lot of hype and possibly front-runner status with the Le Pens and Macrons of the world. And why this is important is significant. Because France has the runoff system, it is not impossible nor unforeseeable to see Barnier playing a very big role in who may get that second runoff, or it may be the two runoffs, because it would be expected that a lot of Macron's support from the right would disappear if it was going to Mr. Barnier as the more traditional candidate of the right. Of course, this is all speculative, but Mr. Barnier has been having meetings with high-ranking Les Républicains figures of numerous wings of the party, which, of course, is very interesting because the election is only just about a year away from now.
I think, yeah, as you stated, Ben, I think the real interesting thing is if this speculation turns out to be true, is that if he does run, what kind of platform does he go for? Will he try and, I mean, we already have a lot of candidates on the right. You see Macron trying to position himself more to confront Marine Le Pen. So what does this actually mean for Macron? Does this mean that a lot of the support that he was hoping for, that he was taking away from the centre-right as he was losing it from his centre-left because of various policies? Does that mean, you know, currently he's going to lose all of that? And what direction does that mean he takes now? Obviously, we'll have to see what kind of platform the Patriot and European kind of thing would go for. It's you know, obviously at the moment it's more of an internal faction. So yeah, who knows how far this could actually take off and how it positions itself. But as you said, it will be very interesting to see if it denies anybody like Macron a chance. To be honest, it could also deny Marine Le Pen. Who knows,
Yeah, exactly.
if it's something that he can take away support from.
Hey, and I think the other interesting thing is the groundwork is there for Barnier to basically be the Les Républicains candidate, because they're such in a weak position that their own candidate, no disrespect to their candidate, is very much a weak figure to run. Having Barnier as the candidate of the Les Républicains would instantly put them back in a position of massive prominence. And if Barnier's, you know, old track record is to be followed, it would probably be a very strong de Gaullist message from him, France at the heart of Europe and also France at the heart of the world. As Barnier, when he was the European negotiator, very much stressed his position that Europe had to be more united on things. So it would be a very interesting effect if he were to be the man in charge of Paris, what his views would be in Europe and globally as well.
I think the final thing I want to point out is that, obviously, based off the kind of general person he is and the kind of policies presented, being very pro-EU and just pro-European in general can only get you so far in French politics. You know, the EU, when polled, is a pretty split issue for some people. That doesn't mean, you know, they want to leave the EU, but it means that people's opinion of it can be, you know, for a lot of people can be quite negative. So how that impacts someone who is pro-EU like Emmanuel Macron, yeah, you know, there are a lot of questions that can be raised, and it will definitely be interesting to stick and follow to this because it could have, you know, significant consequences for what the French the presidential election actually looks like.
Well, yeah, not just that, it also has an impact. Sure, let's hypothetically say Barnier does run and, say, win that presidential election. The relations with Brussels would be very different, as this was their man for about 3 years, was negotiating a trade agreement / withdrawal agreement from its previous member, Britain. He would very much know the system, very much inside and out, unlike most European leaders of the EU. And it also means that a France and British relationship would be very interesting, as the man who very much was there's pain in these negotiations is now the president of Britain's most significant, depending who you ask, adversary or partner in Europe.
Yeah, I completely agree there. You know, things haven't been helped necessarily with someone like Emmanuel Macron, who has definitely taken a very European stance towards everything. So who knows if someone who could possibly rival Macron and be, you know, greater in this pro-EU-ness, how they actually play into, you know, UK EU relations.
Indeed, and just on one last note about Barnier, this is just a fun fact. In the 90s, he was France's Minister for Europe, working alongside one David Davis. Anyone just didn't know that. But anyway, speaking of France, we go to its former colonial holding in Africa, that's once jewel of its previous French empire, and that is Algeria. And Adam can explain what is going on in Algeria this week.
That was a very impressive segue. I hadn't thought of that one. Anyway, so the Algerian president has declared a number of things. So primarily pardons for jailed anti-government activists that, who were arrested in protests last year and the year before that, as well as the main thing, which is calling for early elections. So this follows a crisis-hit country which has sort of grappled with renewed protests on the second anniversary of protests. Of major protests, which saw the resignation of the former president, I'm going to pronounce this wrong, Abdelaziz Bouteflika, I don't know, who served as president for almost 20 years after he attempted to try and run for a fifth term. So for the president here, he's quite concerned because ultimately these are the same activists, the same people who went out onto the streets and completely sort of revolutionized Algerian politics by really, showing in almost like a kind of, second Arab Spring kind of way, but more localized. So legislative elections had been scheduled to be held in 2022, but now the president wants early polls to take place before this year's end, potentially as early as June, but at September at the latest. So quite interestingly, the vote would be held on the basis of a new electoral law that is yet to be adopted, but likely will be, which would impose strict financing regulations to stop funding from abroad. So, a different element that could play into it. So just to get quickly to these jailed anti-government activists and them being freed. So around 55 to 60 people who partook in the protest last year and the year before that would benefit from the amnesty, the president said, with their release due to start immediately. So again, it's not that significant. There are still lots of people who are arrested and in prison related to these protests, which had a very authoritarian crackdown onto them. But at least it's something, I guess. But yeah, I think the real interesting thing has been real pressure from the people, because in recent weeks there have been major demonstrations in the build-up to the 22nd of February anniversary, the first nationwide protest, which was held in 2019, and calls to demonstrate on the 22nd across Algeria are really being presented on social media, as well as with leaflets and that kind of thing. So that will definitely be something we'll cover next time round, because it could be something very major for the country, given the history of protest there. Yeah, I mean, you just have to look at the kind of position that the president is currently in. He was elected after these protests, which saw people reject authoritarianism. But ultimately, the same people who were on the streets boycotted the election because of a very narrow, strict set of candidates was set for the presidential elections in 2019, and they simply weren't happy with it. So it led to an incredibly low turnout of only 40%. So evidently people feel like their leader isn't legitimate. And also the collapse of oil prices due to COVID-19 have also hurt Algerians economically in terms of their living conditions. And that also is another major thing that plays into these kinds of protests.
Yeah, I think I couldn't have heard more fabulous points made about Algeria from Adam per usual. But yeah, I think that's perfectly correct. I think Tellabroun has been very much critical of his parliament and very much annoyed at their speed of doing things. So I think, look, him asking for early elections is to play his hand. Of course, Algeria is in a very messy state because of its historic situation with democracy very, very frail in the country itself, and the fact that prior to this current president, the previous one had ruled the country with for 20 years, depending who you asked, mostly by an iron grip with how he ran it. But it is, of course, interesting to see how the country reacts with an election in the COVID era, and also how Algeria sees itself forward, because Algeria itself has many different versions of where it sees itself as a country, because there are a lot of resources there. Just the COVID epidemic has hurt a lot of what Algeria is very good at in the global sphere.
Yep, I agree completely there. And I think, just as a final note before you take over for the next topic, the real thing to look at with elections following protests as a whole is, do the elite who were in charge in the last regime, I guess, but weren't at the limelight of it, so weren't at the front center stage where everyone hated them, do they still get their place in politics?
Exactly.
And this is the exact same thing that's happened now. Current president had a significant role in the regime prior to him being elected, and ultimately this kind of thing can only keep going for so long. So who knows where this goes? The same thing has happened in Tunisia, where it's considered the success story of the Arab Spring, but we're seeing people who were pro-dictatorship getting major support, and even in the formation of a new constitution and such. That kind of thing was led by people who were major in the previous regime. So, this kind of thing, as I say, can only go on for so long. Who knows if this is something that will happen next time the election comes around. It may be another set of things where people simply don't turn up because they don't feel like the people that they can vote for will change anything. But yeah, I think that's all from me. So do you want to take over the next topic, Peter?
Yeah, I mean, just on a quick point that what you finished up, I think you're absolutely right. I think there's the old saying, those who are part of a regime but not the main light of it tend to always have the best outcome, is that they usually are the ones rebuilding from the previous regime. And we saw that in Tunisia, that a lot of the current government of the last decade that was the pro-democracy thing, were very much people who sat in the previous autocratic government. They just happened to be lucky at the fact that no one really remembered who they were in these timelines. And most of the people who were voting didn't realize that. But on that point, we move on to this week's big conference, virtual conference, because we love COVID. And that is the Munich Security Conference virtually. Of course, Munich Security Conference, for those who may not be aware, is a massive global event, usually involving global leaders, military leaders, diplomats, discussing what they see in the world. It's usually a Western-aligned conference, a very big conference in terms of what is seen. It's usually in Munich, but because it's not in-person, things are not a thing at this current moment. It was held online. And President Biden spoke about his belief that America is back leading the world and Europe on climate change, and also holding people morally responsible. Of course, this Biden speech was made virtually in front of key European allies like Germany, France, and Britain, and stressed the important fact that unlike the Trump administration, Biden would be a lot more open to cooperation with Europe, and also cooperation and return to the return of the Iran nuclear deal, which has been a hot potato topic in Washington and across the world, as many in the Middle East, the Israelis and Saudis, see a return to the Iran agreement or the talks of the Iran agreement as a dangerous and almost, in their minds, a path of of appeasement.
Yeah, I think from my own British perspective and looking at my own Prime Minister, Boris Johnson has had a few quite interesting things to say. So the two major ones is focusing on the fact that he will remain a committed European in terms of European security. He said, and I quote, "Our commitment to European security is unconditional and immovable." And he also highlighted how his recent defense spending increases would make the UK the second biggest NATO contributor after the US. Mm-hmm. So really trying to highlight those transatlantic relations, trying to bring the US back to Europe after a stage in which you can say under Trump, it very much wasn't. And the other interesting thing is that Boris Johnson said that the UK will be the major opposition to China. He highlighted wanting to speak out on China's repression of the Uyghur people in the Xinjiang province, and he said he will continue to do so. And he also highlighted the work that he as a leader has done over Hong Kong and during their protests, and also allowing people from Hong Kong to come to the UK. So, yep, that's just an interesting thing to look forward to. Again, who knows how significant that actually is and how much that will be stuck to. But if will the UK be the one that leads this anti-China, bloc? We've already seen some kind of evidence that this may not necessarily be true. For example, one of the major reasons why the UK stopped bringing Huawei into their 5G infrastructure wasn't due to moral outrage over it was due to the fact that America was really pushing for it. So, there you have a sort of tenuous situation. But, who knows? Maybe this is something that will be the major sticking point for Boris Johnson on his foreign policy agenda.
Well, and on the point about the UK, a big criticism of the current UK government in resolve to China is the genocide bill currently being debated in Parliament. The government has not supported this bill, led by Sir Ian Duncan Smith. It will very much target China for its genocide of the Uyghur people. The British government's argument is it's much better to be decided in committee, which, of course, people like Ian Duncan Smith believe is hogwash. So that's already one area where the UK government is sort of kind of double playing what it's saying about being the leader against China. And I think the other issue is, of course, in Europe, is that China seems to have, pardon me, a very divisive thing with European countries in the EU. I mean, the western part of Europe, the Germanys, the Dutch, the Spanish one, are much more receptive to Chinese cooperation. But you see more in the east, the Polish, the Hungarians, the Slovakians, the Czechs. Well, not the Czechs technically, but the Slovakians, the Polish, the Hungarians, and most of those countries are very much critical of working with China, seeing the security threat there. So it's an interesting fascination to see that NATO really in itself isn't really united yet on a common China policy.
Yeah, and it's particularly interesting because what the EU and US have set out of this conference is there needs to be renewed respect for one another. There needs to be renewed cooperation, and presumably there's going to be a point where China's brought up. And how does the EU and the US take to combating China? You know, even looking at something like Russia, how do the EU and US coordinate with Russia? Coordinate with combating Russia and their aggression, because again, Europe is split on this. You have countries like Estonia who are very much against. You have countries like Estonia who are very much against any kind of real cooperation with Russia, but then you have Germany continuing to insist for gas pipelines to be built, you know, to fuel the country. So again, there are some major differences within Europe internally, and that's not even factoring what the US can do.
Yeah, and I think the funny thing is on Russia, to the US's credit, ironically, everyone but Germany and the EU seems to be more on path with the American position more recently. Maybe France, you can put a question mark there because the French and Russians have always had an interesting relationship. But for the most part, a good chunk of the EU agrees with the American position on Russia. But it's Germany that's the main problem in this, because the current German government, Mrs. Merkel, and her predecessor government, Schrader, like the Russian pipelines going to and providing energy to Germany, which of course many in Europe see as a dangerous thing of Russia holding the continent hostage with that thing. And I think the other thing that is interesting at this conference is that wasn't really mentioned is how will Biden approach the Middle East? Because one could argue the Middle East very much benefited from the Trump foreign policy in terms of the Gulf states who are traditionally aligned with the U.S. How does he handle that approach? Because many of what Biden's administration officials have been talking about, going back to the Iran nuclear agreement and talking about this, pretty sure the mood in many of those Gulf states and Israel is none of very happiness hearing this after very much getting an administration that had their back basically of being more hawkish on Iran. And we've seen Iran in its belief that because there is a return to the table, be a little more, in its mind, flexible in what it could do in the region.
Yep, and I think that's really everything that, you know, from my perspective. I just think that as a whole, there is a lot that the, you know, so-called West believes in, and, you know, there are a lot of threats that they're currently having to take on. But there really does need to be some kind of renewed cooperation to actually get anywhere with it.
Indeed. Moving on, and it was mentioned, I mentioned this lovely organization, that is NATO. So NATO this week announced, because I know that if I say this wrong, the Twitter trolls are going to make sure they hang me for this, that it would increase its force in Iraq from about 500 NATO troops to 5,000 now. This does not involve any American troops at all. This is all non-U.S. NATO members, increasing their participation in Iraq to 5,000. Now, it should be noted the Iraqi government did ask for this increase of troops to help the country maintain some semblance of stability, as the country has slowly slipped away some stability. So the Iraqi government believes that having NATO troops there is helpful. Also, this week there has been a push at NATO to try taking some control back of Afghanistan, as there is a big concern that the Taliban is on the verge of pulling off significant victories in that country due to the fact that the Western troops for the last 10 years or so have been pulling out. And with that, the Taliban has done its advances with the advantage of not having as much Western troops as there are. For example, there are Taliban troops outside of Kabul now, which has now put the Afghanistani government in a very stressful position and very dangerous position of being very critically weak of its own country, which has now put NATO in a major position of having to decide what to do with Afghanistan and now Iraq.
I think the only thing I can really add to this is it is quite interesting, the kind of role that they'll have. So it will primarily be training activities and, with Iraqi security institutions. But the interesting thing is it's going further beyond Baghdad, which is where it's been primarily centered. Already spread across the country. And as you stated, this is being done with the full respect of Iraq's sovereignty and territorial integrity. So clearly this is, showing that there is some concern to be held. And hopefully, the work of NATO is sticking to what is being requested here, because ultimately the only real major way that destabilized countries across the world will cooperate with the West, specifically NATO, is if they really adhere to what they're saying they'll do.
Absolutely. Which has been a big problem what the West has had with countries like Iraq doing operations that traditionally they do not ask ahead of time to do.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, just as a whole, as you said, the fact that Iraq has requested this, it does show possibly that, as I said, not only there are some increasing concerns, but also what does this mean for a future Western Iraq relation, and how does something like that play into the rest of the West sort of agenda in the Middle East? I know I say as if the West has some kind of coherent one, but we can have the general idea that because the US, and then you've also got Germany, France, and the UK then being supportive of the engaging with the Iran deal, does cooperating with Iraq and at least making some more friendly Middle Eastern partners help in that way at all? I have no idea, but it's definitely a possibility.
Indeed, and very much agreed on that front. So we now move on to everyone's favorite category of the week: fun, lovable, loser of the week. Of course, there are many losers this week to nominate to, because funness always comes in all strides. And I let Adam explain his loser of the week, who you may have heard a lot in the news recently.
Yes. So as many people will know, Texas at the moment is experiencing some insane weather. This is causing people's water to freeze, so they can't have access to it. It means they're losing out on warm water. They're losing out on heating to the homes, etc., etc. And it is insane. I didn't know a state which I always thought was desert and cities could get that cold when people have to boil water. So anyway. The real reason I'm pointing out the snowstorm here is that the Texas senator Senator for Texas, Ted Cruz, during all of this, while his constituents are going through this very traumatic time, he decided to take a trip to Mexico. Now, that alone I'd say is quite loser behavior, going off to a place where it's much nicer than where people are suffering. But no, actually, the main reason I'm picking Ted Cruz for Loser of the Week is that the reason he said he took the holiday or took the plane flight away from Texas was because of his daughters and wanting to be a good dad. He threw them under the bus, I guess, is the best way of phrasing it. So sorry, Ted Cruz's daughters, you're the real scapegoat for your dad's career this time around.
Well, and his wife's text got leaked out of a group chat as well. Also very fun as well.
I mean, we should already bring up the fact that Ted Cruz has already, I don't know what the word is for it, but he's accepted insults from Donald Trump about his wife and merely gone on with it. And now he's going on to throwing his daughters under the bus. So maybe that quote of wanting to be a good dad isn't so true.
Great political instincts. My loser of the week is Nina Tardon, Biden's picked for the Office of Management and Budget, who as of today, his nomination is dead because Joe Manchin came out and said that he would not vote for her. And why is this important? Because the Senate is 50-50, and so far it looks like all Republicans will vote against her. And with Manchin announcing his intention to oppose Mrs. Tardon, she now has no way to 50 votes unless a Republican changes their mind, which is unlikely. Mrs. Tardon, as many of you may, if you've been on Twitter, know, has very much had a free will of attacking senators on Twitter when she was a private citizen. 2016, she attacked Republican Senators Mitch McConnell, Susan Collins, Lisa Murkowski, among others, for that. And she's also attacked the chairman of the committee, one of the committees that deals with her nomination, one Bernie Sanders, who she is basically insulted to the point of horrendousness. Now, Mr. Manchin, of course, with his defection to the Republicans on this vote, very much has ended any hope she has being OMB director, which is a win for those who hate her online. And also now means that she will likely be withdrawn very shortly from Senate consideration of what she was hoping to be was the OMB director. Of course, I will caution those who may think another progressive may get nominated. The likely name Bruce Reed, who would be up for the job, is a physical hawk. But that's my loser of the week, Nina Turner.
Wow, what a week it's been. Yep. I think just as a quick thing with our two losers, there is something very common. I guess something maybe in common is just sudden things happening. So for her, Joe Manchin deciding to go, you know what, I'm against now. And then for Ted Cruz, people having phones and actually going, hey, look, he's on a plane. But yeah.
Indeed. I think we're at the end of the show. Per usual, if follow us on Twitter to see the great content shared by our staff and other writers, and follow us on Spotify to hear this podcast whenever you'd like to hear it, depending if you're busy or can't hear us any day of the week. Of course, and we want to thank you all who donated to last week's fundraising project on the redistricting. Hit the target ahead of time, and we thank those for now opening up a realm of possibilities to map out every redistricting scenario.
Woo! And one day we'll have a fundraising for the war tonight, where we'll fund flights for me and Peter to see recorded in person.
Exactly. All of this will be sent to the Cayman Islands, of course, so we don't have to pay anything. I'm joking, of course.
For legal reasons, he is joking.
For legal reasons, I'm joking. Please, IRS, do not come to my house next week.
IRS, I know you're really big fans of The World Tonight, but please, just give him this one chance.
But yes, pay for our in-person meeting, probably somewhere in London, probably. We can probably see Adam's Lip Dem, merchandise hanging from the background.
To be honest, I was kind of thinking like the Bahamas or...
Oh, I'm open to that. The Bahamas, we can always go the Down Under.
Exactly. There are loads of places. We have the world. Well,
exactly.
To be honest, it'd have to be at night when we'd record it for like the sake of consistency with the name and all that. But
true. Yeah. Very true indeed. Anyway, I'll let Adam now close the show.
Yes, thank you all for listening. I hope you've had a really enjoyable experience listening to mine and Peter's voice. He's already done all the social media stuff, so I just hope that you have a wonderful week and you'll listen to us next time around.
Indeed, and we always have fun topics. Anyway, folks, have a good night, stay safe, and get your vaccines.
Bye.